Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mona Fawaz. I'm a professor of urban studies and planning at the American University of Beirut and one of the Beirut Urban Lab research directors. I am thrilled to welcome you on behalf of colleagues at the Beirut Urban Lab, but also Habitat for Humanity, the Norwegian Refugee Council, and UN Habitat. We all came together to put this discussion, housing uncertainties, financial crisis, and social protection. And we're really very happy to welcome everyone this evening. Allow me first 2 words about the conference framework, maybe. So the financialization of shelter across the globe has created major tensions between, on the one hand, the value of apartments as a home, and on the other, its role as a financial asset. Banks, investment companies have penetrated housing markets globally, typically fueled by public incentives, and cities almost everywhere have seen housing prices skyrocket. Conversely, as housing markets are being flooded with financial capital, too often with substantial public incentives, the development discourse about the right to shelter for middle and lower income groups is being reduced to the World Bank's famous mantra, basically market enablement. So just like education, healthcare, and many other aspects of our lives, with neoliberalism and now financialization, we are delegating housing to the market. Within this paradigm, public support to housing is only actualized for citizens, either if they can demonstrate that they're eligible to a market opportunity, so they are deserving of a loan, or on the other hand, if they're too poor and hence deserve charity. Consequently, housing stress, the high cost of housing relative to income, whether in the form of mortgages for middle income earners, developers' loans for working class aspiring homeowners, or rent for lower income city dwellers, has increased exponentially, causing unreasonable strain for large sections of urban populations. Among those, the most vulnerable are forced into precarious living, which means that they typically live in the interstices of middle-class neighborhoods or in camps, slums, informal settlements, where they're going to face the dual challenge of, on the one hand, really poor living conditions, and on the other hand, long-term uncertainty. These conditions overlap with additional forms of disenfranchisement, which all of us are seeing daily: presence of labor, refugees, migrants, who are often criminalized for their presence in the city. Not only does financialization penetrate housing, but it also exposes this basic need to the rhythm of its crisis. We live in a world where there's no longer a necessity to define what is a financial crisis. Almost all of us have lived one with more or less severity. And if we experience financial crisis differently based on our class, gender, geography, and other factors, we all know now pretty well what it means to go through a financial crisis. From the global crisis that hit the world in 2008, all the way to Greece, Ireland, Argentina, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and in the Arab region, Egypt and Lebanon, we are regularly accustomed to one after the other rounds of financial crisis. And I should say, it's been pretty severe here in Lebanon, where the crisis has unfolded for almost 4 years without a single rescue package or reform, currency having lost 95% of its value, and the situation continues to unfold. Moreover, it's important to recognize that these financial crises in the last 2 or 3 decades have increasingly been intertwined with housing. Thus, the 2008 global financial crisis, which is considered one of the deepest economic downturns of our contemporary histories, is typically studied in relation to what people have called the subprime mortgages, right? The extension of these credits to low-income city dwellers in the US, and the combination of cheap money induced by low interest rates with relatively loose credit requirements. These severe moments do not unfold, however, only in excessive moments. We are not seeing crisis and then return to normal. Instead, we're living financial crisis and destabilization in a world which at the same time continues to be destabilized, and where things like uncertainty, precarious housing conditions, employment that's unstable, healthcare that's not available are becoming really very common. In countries where mortgages have been normalized, the financial crisis also takes more shapes and more questions are being raised. What happens when you borrowed money and suddenly the markets crash? What happens when you're disenfranchised and you've been living in inadequate housing and then a crisis hits? Financial crises are exposing housing to be addressed both to their rhythm, but also to the solutions that are being put forward to housing. And this is very much my final point. Not only do we see housing being affected by the rhythm of financial crisis, but we see that the typical solutions offered to financial crisis are being also introduced for housing. Austerity on the one hand, and this notion of social protection, which has entered the discussion in the recent years. For us in Beirut, we had never heard about social protection until the financial meltdown 4 years ago. A few months after, international organizations made us pretty aware of what it means and how do we deploy it, yet very few spoke about it in relation to housing. So social protections, we have learned, are emergency interventions typically introduced to reduce strain on exposed individuals and families from the dire consequences of shocks or crises such as financial meltdowns. In moments when traditional social policy programs designed with the frameworks of a modern nation state, right, guarantees to human rights, to protection, to reducing vulnerability, are abandoned by public agencies, even in countries where they were never really provided, at least their promise was there. Public agencies paralyzed by bankruptcy are increasingly looking for support in the form of temporary relief responses. These change very much the shape of the relation between citizens and the state, and in some ways privatize or delegate to the philanthropic, local and international actors the task of protecting citizens. It is noteworthy that despite the critical role adequate shelter plays in long-term well-being, it rarely figures on social protection schemes. Hence, our attention in this conference, in this discussion series, bringing these issues together. We wanted to connect the issue of financial crisis with the notions of uncertainties, whether they're related to mortgages that are unpaid, housing stresses that are difficult, but also precarious conditions that get exacerbated with these social protections. And so the Urban Lab with conference co-organizers are probing through the series that extends over the month of June, the possibilities that are afforded or perhaps foreclosed by crisis, or maybe perhaps should have been afforded, in contexts where possibly social securities were anyway absented, where social protection schemes may extend help for those who are considered deserving, but at the same time leave urban majorities unprotected. We will discuss questions such as how does housing financialization materialize in urban contexts? What do specific tools like housing loans facilitate or not? And how do they unfold in different contexts, expected or not? In an increasingly precarized population, a population that has a hard time dealing with insecurities to access food, work, and homes, how does uncertainty materialize? And how is it lived with and possibly resisted in times of financial crisis? We will first go through every Tuesday through a discussion series with colleagues, scholars, but also professionals, a fantastic lineup, I should say, that I'm very excited to learn from, colleagues from the Arab Middle East and North Africa, but also well beyond. Before I introduce the speaker, I need to just say that in order to put together this series, I'm very proud to be introducing this on behalf of colleagues, but really a shout out is due, particularly to two young, super motivated scholars and activists, Saham Nemne from the Beirut Urban Lab and Deena Khalil from Habitat for Humanity, both of whom, and I can tell you, my inbox is flooded, have worked around the clock to identify and reach out to scholars and make this series happen, but also our partners at UN Habitat, particularly Sara Saad and Nanor Karagiosian, And at Habitat, again, Samar Farhat, I should mention, at NRC, Fuad Bajani, among other members of the team. As usual, the Beirut Urban Lab researchers have all been involved, from designing the poster to sticking it everywhere around the city to sharing. So gratitude to all the communication teams, to all the 4 groups who have managed to have 200 people registered for this series. So we're very excited. And now, maybe to start, because I've overextended my introduction, allow me to introduce Professor Raquel Rolnik. And I really cannot think of a more incredible speaker to start this discussion. It's an incredible pleasure and honor to welcome you today, Professor Rolnik. So for those of you who may not know her, I doubt there are some of you who don't, but still, Raquel is professor of the Faculty of Architecture and Urbanism at the University of São Paulo. She's an architect and urban planner with over 35 years of scholarship, activism, and practical experience in planning, urban policy, and housing. In her career, she has held various government positions, including being the director of the planning department of the city of São Paulo and national secretary for urban programs of the Brazilian Ministry of Cities. She has also been urban policy coordinator of the Policy Institute. Between 2008 and 2014, Dr. Rolnik served as UN Special Rapporteur on adequate housing for a 6-year mandate. She's the author of several books and articles that I really, really encourage you to read. But you won't need my encouragement after you hear her. Professor Rolnik, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure and a privilege and an honor to open this series, which I hope will be very interesting and enticing for everybody. I wish I were there in person with you in Beirut, in Lebanon, but here we are again on screen. So I will try to share with you in this opportunity the result of many years of following critically the financialization of built space in general and housing in particular, which I call in my book, Urban Warfare, the empire of finance, which is colonizing our cities and territories. By that time, in the book, I was describing the global paradigm shift that Mona was referring to, which occurred in the planet, in housing systems and housing policies that shifted housing from being a social policy, a natural one, or at least a desire to have one, a human right, into a commodity, into a financial asset through basically, in this first wave, the scheme of promoting home ownership through credit for all. But after the 2008 financial crisis, we are witnessing important changes, and I will try to explore them today as well. Some of them, I would say, in an adventurous way, because it's an upcoming process that, again, is global, it's planetary, but it's different in every place. And I call that, and that's why it's the title of my lecture, after the mess which was created by the first wave of housing financialization, which was the financial crisis, the mortgage crisis, that became an international housing crisis as well. The empire strikes again. The empire strikes back, because what we are witnessing today is an even more acute and extended colonization of built space to generate rent-seeking landscapes. So those rent-seeking landscapes despite affirming uniqueness and singularities in their spectacular forms. So I'm talking about these international shopping malls, international downtown renewal projects with glooming towers. They repeat themselves over and over again across the globe. Corporate towers, the tallest building in the world, shopping malls, international hotels, housing plantations in the peripheries of our cities. They are what I can call rent-seeking landscapes. They are products for real estate financial complex. They are vehicles for future rent extraction and space and time speculative markets. They take over our cities and our policies with an active role of state and planning, and I would repeat that over because it's something that we are also responsible for as planners in our cities, especially in our cities in the peripheries of capitalism. So this take over our cities in order to offer in a spray those products to attract this electronic cloud of financial flexes that are flying, floating over the planet in order to seek new frontiers to park and extract revenue for their investments. And I'm talking about urban renewal projects. I'm talking about housing complexes and many different products that are clearly promoted and eventually subsidized by our state and policies. But more than a new form of organizing capital and economy, we are talking about a new biopolitics in its reorganization of bodies, subjectivities, and forms of political territorial organization, because space is not just the materiality of built space, but it's also ways of organizing life. Yes, our old markets in the traditional city are very different from shopping malls, and it's a different subjectivity which is embedded in it. And those are very much marked by private regimes of territorial control. And I think this is very important for us to retain, with the only goal of generating rent, interest for global and local capital invested, and it's increasingly impossible to separate local and global because there is no blockages, no difficulties for financial capital to move around the planet freely and to park immediately where it wishes in the hunger of assets. So that's financialization. It's a new colonial power which is deterritorialized, abstract, fixed, and speculative by nature, made by an electronic digital cloud of the global platform, which is capable of concentrate in the virtual space what is dispersed in the material space. It's able to make circulate in this abstract circuit what was fixed in space, the materiality of built space, and at an unprecedented scale, enhanced by a mass of surplus capital which is available and ready to circulate because any barrier to circulate was removed. Yes, we are talking about several processes which occur simultaneously. Changes in the political economy of work, Uberization, and the role of state and the nature of the state, and Mona was also referring to that, the dismantling of the actual existing or the desire of welfare state and forms of action of financial capital, social demands that became tied to financial capital. It's the financialization of social rights, including pension, including the organization of pension funds, which are big players in the real estate financial complex because of their expectation of a long-term return. This is typically related of this type of assets. A central role of built space in the financial circuit, as built space is the perfect collateral, and we know very well how it works. When we go to a bank and we ask for a loan, for credit, the bank manager will immediately ask, do you have any house, any home, any apartment to act as a collateral? It's the best collateral because it does not move, it does not disappear, it stays there, it stays put, it can devaluate, but then it can again have a cycle of appreciation of value. So it's perfect collateral for a long-term expectation on capital investment. That's why this very large mass of surplus capital, who is not in a hurry to get immediate return to capital, which have long-term expectations for that, is ready to take over to part. But this, and we'll see that we ourselves, our poor citizens, residents, we have to compete for space with this mass of surplus capital. So what is this mass of surplus capital? Pension funds for every country, sovereign funds of different countries, state kings and their surplus of capital, plutocrat, Chinese, Russian plutocrats, the investment fund of big corporations like Apple, Google, and things like that. So those are the actors who are really playing in this scene. Then plus a new phase of capitalism where high frequency trading, which combines digital electronic means. So we are talking about a social temporal compression through sophisticated algorithms by which capital is mobilized and accumulated, betting on expectation of future value in a new form of assembly line, which disassembles and reconnects capital, concentrating more and more in fewer hands of powerful corporations and the territorialized investment funds. So when we're talking about this spatio-temporal compression, capital can move, can enter and exit from built space to different instruments in a second. So this makes a lot of difference. So after 2008, after the mortgage and financial crisis, a new wave of financialization of housing became through rental housing. Rental housing is the new frontier. It's the exploitation of built space by fractions of time. It's a complete different logic than home ownership. And how that happens and what are the examples that we can give of this new form, which does not replace completely the old one, but adds other layers and other forms for the existing financialization of home ownership. And I can give an example, Airbnb. Airbnb is financialization of rent. It's a digital platform that makes possible, it's a digital platform made, it's an international it's an asset manager, it's an international investment fund that makes possible to extract revenue from a very dispersed set of renting out fractions and pieces of homes in everywhere in the world. Another form, corporate landlords like Blackstone, but there are many examples of asset managers that bought the devaluated stock after the financial crisis, the devaluated housing stock that was left over all over, and put them into rent with the capacity of establishing a new level of rent seeking and exploiting rent from many, many people. Also, cities and public agencies that were obliged to sell out their stock, their housing stock, to those asset managers who deal with the stock in a completely different way from the public agencies, because their commitment is the revenue that they are promising to the investors that made up their fund. So the result of that is renting climbing, going up and up and up. And we have a new housing crisis, which has been added to the old one, which is the rental crisis. And especially in some cities, touristic cities like London, like Barcelona, it's particularly acute, but we are seeing that everywhere. So build space, it's here. I think we are radicalizing the idea that build space is becoming less and less a value for life, a place that we used to call home, which is much more than four walls and a roof over your head, but community living, organizing life, neighbors, connection with place. So with the rent and these new forms of extracting rent, fractions of time, very flexible, that you can be moving again and again and again in order to find a cheaper place to live, an accessible place to live, you are destroying completely this idea of home as a living place. You are destroying completely the idea of landscape for life and converting completely into rent-seeking landscapes. And we are seeing that now, the shift to housing as a service. What are the effects? And I will finish with some thoughts on that. Once more, like in the previous phase, the result, the previous phase was the home ownership through credit expansion in the first wave. The result is dispossession, displacement, housing crisis, an emergency in many, many cities, in many, many countries. Especially, again, we are not talking for something very democratic, but especially for ethnic, non-white, poor, vulnerable, and young people. So a process which are evicting urban residents who are priced out from the neighborhoods they used to live. Once more, the financial logic of the operation, the bet and strategy to make sure that revenues from invested capital will increase from people's needs, generating a new movement again of resistance. And I'm talking about tenants organizations, rent strikes, tenant unions that are arising in many, many different places. Again, and this is very important for us here, the central role of state, generating new incentives to the entry of corporate landlords, international cooperation agencies now promoting seminars, the World Bank, the International Development Bank, promoting seminars. Oh, let's implement, let's enforce rental housing policies. And we said, oh, good, finally, we are not only talking about home ownership, but again, there is a coloniality trap again in the terms that this promoting of housing policy is the promotion of this new business and making possible for this new business to occur in different places with subsidies, with public money, with public land, with public budget also eventually. I think I will finish by pointing out the role of planning and policies on destroying landscapes of life in order to open space for these new schemes by, and this is very, it's not new, but I will recall here, by reproducing the one and only model of housing that should be reproduced everywhere, the housing plantations, as I call them, both materially, but also as an ideology, and an ideology that stigmatized and criminalized the so-called informal ways of living. At the same time, it's important that this process of displacement, of permanent temporariness, is reproducing precarity, is reproducing new forms of living for those who are priced out of the city, priced out of those products. And again, those new places are again stigmatized by. But watch out, and I will finish with this, which is what we are researching right now here in Brazil, is the financialization of informal settlements through rental housing, who is expanding madly everywhere in informal settlements, and its private regimes of control, and the production of precarious housing becomes also connected to finance and to global finance, to new forms, digital platforms, in a way that it's not important anymore. If we say the previous phase, we would say, let's destroy informal settlements in order to build housing plantations. And that was the new open of frontiers of financialization. Now, we don't need to destroy those settlements, but we don't need to offer them better conditions of living. We don't need to include them in new forms of providing landscapes of life. We don't protect them. We don't improve them anymore, because even in a very precarious way, they can still be connected to the international financial system and still be able to generate revenue. Precarity generating revenue. Again, concentrated revenue in few hands. I would leave you with that provocation, and let's hear our discussion. Thank you very, very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Raquel, for your presentation. As usual, a real tour de force. We have gone from the big picture of how things are changing towards more detail, then thinking through glimpses of hope and resistance, because there's always elements of that in Raquel's presentation, and then maybe some warnings on what is happening now as a new wave of financialization is trying to penetrate more precarious urban landscapes. So I think you've posed for our lecture series, or our discussion series, many critical questions that will be hard to follow. In addition to the questions that we've posed, you've touched on the role of technology, you've touched on the facility in which capital flows from one place to another, but also, and I think this is particularly important, and maybe if I wanted to follow up with a question I'd ask there, we often think of capital as something global and actors as being, as imagined very much as transnational, corporate. They look like American banks, and they're dressed in well-cut suits. So if I were to ask a question to just engage, I would say, how would you say is the role of local actors that we don't expect to be part of financialization? What are institutions, agencies, actors that don't resemble what we see in New York or London, but that are very active in cities like São Paulo, and I can also speak of Beirut and Cairo and other contexts. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more to that, just in a couple of minutes before we pass on the helm to Deena and to our fantastic speakers.
Thank you. Yes, that's a great question. I really don't know, and I'm not familiar with the Lebanese context, so I will take the examples from São Paulo, from Latin America, basically. So what we see two movements, which are not, I would say, they are not completely opposed. They have some things in common. One is organized squatting. So organized squatting and the taking over of land in order to produce landscape for life, in order to produce housing and neighborhoods that can, it has two senses on that. In one way, is yes, it's clear that it's a reply out of precarity, a reply out of lack of option. But another layer of that is the fact that that produces types of ties between peoples and territories that are not reduced to their economic value. And these ties are and has been and are still are very barriers in order to this part of the urban territory to be taken and to be colonized by finance. In this way, it's a place which is protected from the taking over of finance, but still it's very precarious in material terms. So you see that at the same time, you have in these same spaces the penetration of financial logic that try to extract from that also the connections. But I would say that all the movements that are based on types of ties, which are not clearly individual freehold property, are concrete barriers to the space to be taken over by finance. And I would say cooperatives, community land trust, self-organized urbanization and self-rehabilitation of squatting are this type. But again, the warning that I made at the end of my talk is that even in those spaces, with these new forms of rental housing, we are penetrating in a very dangerous way because one of the last barriers for finance to take over all the territories that was done in the case of favelas, of informal settlements, by destroying, displacing, evicting, and then renewal and converting that space in a different space, now can be done without doing that and maintaining the way it is organized. So this is a huge, huge challenge for those who are struggling and evolving on the idea that cities should be based on the need, should be based on the need to protect people, their lives, their living, and their desires for prosperity.
Thank you, Raquel. I really cannot thank you enough for offering this fantastic introduction to our series. And I think we can now move with the first panel. We have very distinguished speakers. And to introduce and moderate this first panel, allow me to introduce our partner in crime, Dr. Deena Khalil. Deena is manager of the Middle East and North Africa Urban Housing Practitioners Hub at Habitat for Humanity International. She's also adjunct assistant professor in the sociology department at the American University in Cairo. Deena is a founding member of the Network of Urban Studies in Egypt. She holds a PhD in development planning from the University College London and an MA in economics and international development from AUC, the American University in Cairo. Thank you, Deena, for taking this on. Thank you so much again, Raquel. Thank you to our speaker and also to all the audience. I'm seeing many, many names that I wish I could talk to and that I miss. So it's wonderful to be here. Deena, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mona and Raquel. That was an amazing introduction to the series and such a rich coverage of the complex relationship between housing as a form of shelter and basic human right on the one hand, and housing as a financial asset on the other. And I think one key takeaway from this discussion is that as housing is commodified as a financial asset, it becomes increasingly disconnected from the needs of those who actually require it for shelter, especially, of course, in urban areas. And as this disconnect becomes more and more pronounced, we're seeing distortions in housing markets across the globe. And many Arab cities, or many cities in the Arab region rather, and elsewhere, have been experiencing the curious phenomenon of having an oversupply of luxury housing on the one hand, in tandem with a gap in affordable housing. And so you have millions continuing to live in informal settlements, while at the same time you can drive, at least in Cairo, this is the case, you can drive along certain roads or neighborhoods and see rows and rows of completely vacant buildings. And I think that juxtaposition between housing as shelter and housing as a financial asset is precisely what we are here to discuss today, to raise critical questions about how this is all unfolding and what are the consequences of the ways in which housing has been tied to financial markets, and what impact has this had on distorting the housing sector and making it increasingly difficult to access housing, not only among lower income families, but even increasingly among middle-class families and individuals. And to help discuss this today, I couldn't think of a better panel. And I think this panel will really build on the incredible introductory comments and discussion that we just had from Raquel and Mona. And will also reflect diverse viewpoints from different parts of the world. We'll unfortunately not have the opportunity to hear about the West Bank as Tarek is unfortunately unable to join us. But I'm very excited to hear about the context of Egypt and Greece. I'll introduce each speaker to you before they speak. So I'm going to start with Dr. Dalia Wahdan. Dalia Wahdan is adjunct associate professor at the School of Public Policy at the American University in Cairo. She studies urbanization and urbanism in the Middle East and North Africa and South Asian regions, focusing on the built environment, finance, spatial and temporal dynamics, risk, and urban ecologies. She has published widely. Her publications address issues related to urban planning, vulnerability, subjectivity, dependency, coloniality, and equity. Her books include Planning Egypt's New Settlements, The Politics of Spatial Inequalities. She serves as research, training, and policy consultant to various governments and non-governmental organizations, including as head of the Board of Trustees of Greenpeace-MENA. She also serves on several editorial and thesis boards. And Dalia, I'm really looking forward to hearing you speak about how Egypt has been seeing all this play out. I just want to make a quick note before I hand over the mic, so to speak, to Dalia. For those of you in the audience, if you have any questions that come to mind while listening to Dalia's presentation, you can either drop it in the chat, or if you prefer to make a note for yourself. And then when we get to the discussion portion of the session, I will either go to the questions that have been raised in the chat, or I will call on those who have their hands raised at the time. So without further ado, Dalia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay. At the start, I need to mention that my presentation today benefited from extensive discussions with and contributions from Engineer Tamer Shayal from Harvard, and the late urban designer, Professor Holger Gladys from the German University in Cairo. Let me start. In the decade following the Egyptian uprising in 2011, Egypt's state agencies embarked on a scheme to reconfigure the country's national space. Major projects range from the construction of a second navigation canal in 2014 to ambitious plans to reclaim 4 million fedans of desert land, to building 22 new industrial cities, 25 tourist cities, 8 airports and 3 ports, plus the Cairo monorail, touted as the longest in the world. In 2015, the Egypt's Economic Development Conference on 13th of March, the Egyptian Housing Minister Mustafa Madbouri announced a plan to move the capital from Cairo to a new desert city that would host 6.5 million people and to build over 4,000 kilometers of highways, logistics infrastructure connected to special economic zones. In July 2021, after 8 years in office, President Sisi announced his new republic as the quote-unquote dawn of a modern future, premised primarily upon mega economic infrastructure projects, national social infrastructure initiatives, and democratic principles. By the year's end, construction and building accounted for 7.7% of the gross domestic product, and the real estate ownership and services sectors accounted for another 11.4%, superseded only by tourism, the extractive sector, and revenues from the Suez Canal, according to the Central Bank of Egypt in November 2022. It is important to see this frenzy of infrastructure development against the status of the Egyptian economy in the global market. In the financial year 21-22, the Egyptian economy was worth 0.02% or US $4,004 billion of the world economy, with imports worth 72.4 billion against a meager of 40.10 billion of exports. Meanwhile, the country's credit rating fluctuates. For instance, in 2022, Allianz rated the country at C3, quote-unquote sensitive risk for enterprise, while the Economist Intelligence Unit rated the country's economic structure risk factor at B, indicating high public debt to GDP ratio. It rated its sovereign risk at B with a negative outlook, indicating high fiscal deficit as a proportion of GDP, and its political risk at CCC, indicating that the tight control over institutions could cause social unrest. Nevertheless, the state continues to build big and quick. The resurgence of the mega infrastructure projects should be understood within two converging forces. The first, the global infrastructure scramble driven by the surpluses of technologies and the imperatives of financial capital in the global north and China. And second, the shifts in multilateral development architecture and linkages to private financial markets. The global scramble for infrastructure financing picked up in the aftermath of the North Atlantic financial crisis in 2007 and 2008, when so-called traditional bank lending slowed down substantially and banks adjusted to tighter regulatory controls emanating from the stricter Basel III capital and liquidity requirements. In 2022, the G20 explicitly stated their objective to establish infrastructure as a rewarding asset class, compared to traditional investments in private equity or natural resource extractions. And global asset management advisors, the likes of McKinsey and Company, market infrastructure as a resilient asset during worsening economic conditions. This narrative does not target private individual investors only. It addresses international investors in the main. These include multilateral development banks and other non-banking financial institutions across diverse sectors. It comes as no surprise that in 2017, the World Bank pledged $12 trillion worth of investment opportunities in the so-called bankable infrastructure to global investors, and estimated that globally the need for infrastructure was forecast to reach $94 trillion between 2016 and 2040, with another $3.5 trillion to meet SDGs for electricity and water. Linking infrastructure financial investments to the Sustainable Development Goals and the development industry is indeed the second converging force behind the infrastructure scramble. In the Wall Street Consensus, Daniela Gabor uncovers how the quote-unquote strategies to escort financial capital into infrastructure investments have been building upon a holy trinity, started under the Washington Consensus in the previous century, which namely was macroeconomic stabilization, liberalization of capital markets, and the privatization of state-owned assets. Extending the mantra that development is best served by non-state agents, financial and institutional engineering has since been creating diverse project finance vehicles, mezzanine and bridge financing, joint ventures, contractual agreements, partnerships beyond the common public and private binary, with diverse risk distribution parameters across investment portfolios and partnering entities. So the risk gets distributed unevenly across partnering entities. The basic premise of development became the establishment of regimes that provide regulatory and institutional frameworks that ensure core standards of investor protection against expropriation, that set clear policies for land transactions, dispute resolution, and contract renegotiations. In precise terms, the scramble for infrastructure is organically the financialization of development through strategies of de-risking. Since then, scholars have been examining the knowns and the unknowns of what is called the de-risking state, especially with mounting sovereign debts. For instance, Chris Humphrey in 2016 gave a more granular analysis of the financing models of multilateral development banks, or MDBs, namely the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the Andean Development Corporation, arguing convincingly that access of MDBs to private capital markets to secure their core finances establishes a reliance on bond buyers' understanding of what is safe and sound. In the process, MDBs make an quote-unquote autonomy resources trade-off, whereby decisions over development projects, whether in Egypt or elsewhere, become less about real needs of citizens or governments of the borrowing countries and more about the exigencies of capital markets. When the choice is between maintaining, quote-unquote, maintaining rigid adherence to its original mission and securing the resources needed to survive, MDBs frequently choose the latter. By accessing capital markets and adjusting to the imperatives of bond buyers, MDBs gain leverage in negotiating their mandates with their owners, the shareholding governments. Meanwhile, bond buyers, and that's quote, bond buyers are not concerned with economic development or poverty reduction, the stated purpose for which governments created the MDBs, but rather the security of their investment, end of quote. This convergence of forces consolidated the global narrative of infrastructure gap, a gap between capital in need for de-risked circulation and economies in need of infrastructure. This narrative is one of utmost urgency, not only the urgency to save uncirculated capital, but also to save economies with deficiencies, where revenues from productive sectors or tax revenues and aid alone cannot do the job. Hence, the urgency to recycle liquidity from the global north in, quote unquote, countries lower in the global money hierarchy. In other words, the infrastructure gap is simultaneously a financial and a territorial gap between developed and less developed countries. As seen in this chart, to my knowledge, there has been no diligent verification of those gross numbers or any released estimation in sector-specific units, such as road kilometers or power kilowatts, which would give a feel of the real demand for mega infrastructure. I am by no means implying that infrastructure is not useful for economic growth. Rather, I am pointing at how the narrative is primarily laid out in finance lingo with a de facto assumption that it represents social or real demand. Nevertheless, this narrative portrays the infrastructure asset class as a sure bet and its frontiers as readily expansive. Whether it's about transport or agriculture, the land infrastructure finance and the farmland agriculture finance nexus are rolling out across countries in the MENA region and sub-Saharan Africa. Whether feasible or not, this sure bet seems, quote unquote, higher risk adjusted. It's higher risk adjusted and more stable than established alternative asset class at home in the first world. This is by Uma in 2014. It's within this narrative that in 2022, the Global Infrastructure Facility decried the pittance and the declining share of public-private partnerships in infrastructure in the MENA region, going down to US 626 million in 2021, 90% less than year 2020, and 81% under previous 5-year average. Since the magnitude of infrastructure deemed necessary in the MENA region and other African countries would hardly be possible through budgetary outlays or the direct transfer of assets from public to private hands, the narrative for financialization as a modality that might not necessarily require either government outlays or privatization is given logical urgency. In countries lower in the financial and monetary hierarchy, like the case of Egypt, there is room for the establishment of diverse finance mechanisms, such as sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, insurance, family offices, endowment funds, high net worth individuals, development financial institutions. In countries with federal governments like India, ample decentralization and stock exchange mechanisms linked to global trading. There is also room for municipal bonds and other subnational finance instruments, which is actually lacking in Egypt. For countries without, there is always the option of establishing regional investment banks and regional business coalitions. In the case of Egypt, country-specific quasi-sovereign wealth funds and direct monetary assistance from the oil-rich Gulf is a bailout option when things go awry. We already, I think, have established the sovereign fund and the quasi-sovereign fund. Project finance or non-recourse financing, as well as special purpose vehicles for infrastructure maintenance and for addressing social objectives, such as universal service provision or small and micro enterprise development, can also be critical to successful infrastructure development programs, provided that the sources of project finance are kept as varied as possible to distribute risks and liabilities across diversified portfolios. Despite this, the MENA region has not satisfied the appetite for infrastructure financiers, including in Egypt, until date, with only 0.05% of its GDP invested in infrastructure public and PPPs. Yet Egypt seems a promising frontier. The World Bank states that between 1990 and 2021, Egypt had a total of 58 projects that reached financial closure. This does not mean that the projects are actually operating. They reached financial closure with total investments of $15.5 billion US. Electricity projects topped the list with 33 projects, while railway bottomed with 1% worth, which is $5 million US. This performance was possible through a spectrum of reforms in Egypt that started in 2003. These reforms were to the banking sector, to the non-banking sectors, which is actually booming, to the public sector agencies that were traditionally service bureaucracies, but now are acting as non-banking and securitization agencies, like, for instance, the New Urban Communities Authority or the National Tunnels Authority. And this thing began, as I said, in 2003. Although Egypt knew urbanization by massive construction, building, and land reclamation since 1805, the country entered the 20th century with weak institutions. The economic reforms and structural adjustment programs initiated in the 1980s and 1990s under Mubarak intended to establish and strengthen the enabling environment for infrastructure investment. So what we're witnessing now in Egypt has actually started in 2003 and laid down the foundations for the emergence in 2015 of the investment regime and subsequently the infrastructure state, particularly after 2011. The economic adjustments, or IRSAP, initiated 3 sets of reforms of very specific relevance to the land infrastructure nexus that we're witnessing at the moment, and we're actually participating in it. As I said, reforms to the banking sector, reforms to the Central Bank of Egypt, initiation of the non-banking financial services and their booming, and reforms to selected public agencies to act as self-financing securitization agencies. In fact, the explicit declaration, for instance, in 2015 to set the infrastructure connectivity imperative as its priority marks Egypt's entry into what Schindler and Kenai call the territorial moment, at which the ambition was no less than restructuring of the national space economy through infrastructure and urban development. Besides the reforms and the shifts that started in 2003, the run for this moment also involved transformations of the planning functions of the state. Central planning, in the sense of a group of experts, civil or military, conducting rigorous studies and designing 5 or 10-year comprehensive plans, is no longer the case in Egypt, even though the public organizations mandated with planning still stand, such as the General Organization for Physical Planning, GOP, and the Ministry of Planning. While GOP has been hollowed out completely with the establishment of the Supreme Council for Planning and Urban Development by Law 119 of 2008, and appears only as participant in the so-called participatory planning initiatives run by international development organizations, the Ministry of Planning has undergone a facelift and assumes the apex role of orchestrating and monitoring key performance indicators laid out by global agendas, the likes of the SDGs, the New Urban Agenda, Egypt 2015, Cairo 2025. Interestingly, glossy prototypical reports have replaced the multi-volume plan documents, and what is generally referred to as plans come in the form of maps, cartographic or digital, plotting out the territorial spread of national development projects. Rarely does anybody raise the question, how did the map come to replace the plan and what is lost along the way? I do not imply that planning as design of the future should remain analog. Instead, I mean that national planning has become recolonized by global agendas in cahoots with the state. Similarly, international development organizations have been pouring funds and energies into participatory planning or the localization of sustainable development goals and into training on monitoring and evaluation of key so-called good governance indicators. Yet I believe that no amount of participatory planning and localization could substitute for the absence of formal, effective, and transparent democratic institutions that represent real local needs. And I think in Egypt, we know that the local elections have been stalled since 2016. Such global neo-coloniality, notwithstanding, the transformations within the state apparatus could not be overemphasized. The state in Egypt has been restructured organizationally and legislatively such that most, if not all, planning functions are currently within the mandate of the presidency office. The 4 supposedly independent national auditing institutions have been restructured in 2015 under Law 16 to report to the president. On the urban scale, the Supreme Council for Planning and Urban Development stamps projects that are decided by the Ministry of Defense and its associated Armed Forces Engineering Authority. While several presidential and prime ministerial decrees have been issued since 2016 to transform public utilities into economic agencies and allow them to avail of financial markets and services, however, those agencies do not have the power to formulate respective or coordinated economic sector plans. Given this context, one can assume that planning Egypt has become reconcentrated, but the so-called plans shift temporally and spatially in reaction to global financial and international development appetites. The reconstruction or the reconcentration, of planning, the banking and finance sectors reforms, the restructuring of urban spaces through mega projects of infrastructure, real estate, new cities, and the territorial power to harness connectivity all come together to establish a regime of infrastructure-led development with the aim to plug in the national territories to global markets and networks in smooth resonance with what Schindler and Kenai's argument regarding getting the territory right. So what's happening in Egypt now is getting the territory right. However, the Egyptian case still brings more nuanced light to this argument. The convergence of the global appetite for assetization, financialization, and de-risking development come quite handy to the ruling regime of Egypt. Firstly, these forces justify restructuring and downsizing of large bureaucratic agencies to fit into partnership models. What was previously political suicide in countries like Egypt and India is now underway, evident in the transformation of public bureaucracies into revenue-generating or non-banking financial structures, the reduction of government spending on payrolls, the changes of state agencies' mandates and retirement laws, and digitization of functions. Secondly, the finance imperative requires a command and control type of ruling regime, relatively easy in the absence of democracy, not only for stabilizing fiscal and monetary policies, but also for securing lands for infrastructure development. Land-financed infrastructure does not only open diverse revenue streams to the regime in power, it absolves it from the need to further stretch its already strained budgets and provides ready-made symbolic power leverage. In Egypt, dominance of the military establishment over many economic sectors is consolidated by the fact that it is the establishment, or it is this establishment, the military establishment, is at once the obligor of financialization and the guarantor of financial instruments that make the mega projects such as the new administrative capital, the Cairo monorail, the city of New Alamein, the power plants and the transportation networks, etc., possible. And in fact, the obligor is different from the guarantor, but it's interesting that the same agency plays the same role. Thirdly, the potential of land infrastructure finance to establish ever-changing regional alliances is important in propping the legitimacy deficient regime. Born out of financial and institutional modeling, the government can now appeal to a wider range of partners and can establish investment entities that transcend national jurisdictions. As stated earlier, the resurgence of sovereign or quasi-sovereign wealth funds could be studied in conjunction with the resurgence of mega projects that in turn lend symbolic power to governments with depleted legitimacy. Equally handy are narratives of employment generation, entrepreneurial support, and the ability to build big and quick, which make effective fodder for mass propaganda. Lastly, land is essential to infrastructure and real estate. Yet countries of the global south, including Egypt, have chronic inefficiencies in land markets. In Egypt, it is common knowledge that the military establishment and public institutions hold most lands. The financial turn in infrastructure drives the state to expand and consolidate land banks and to deploy diverse value capture instruments, some of which have been in use since the 1990s, such as the sale of development rights, while others were dormant or forgotten since the 1950s, such as betterment levies. Not to mention that nationalization and eminent domain are also ad hoc policy instruments deployed by the state in Egypt in many instances across history. Anyway, setting the territory right is not an easy feat, especially when the land infrastructure finance nexus possesses multiple inherent risks, at least in Egypt. One category of risks is inherent in the financial instruments themselves that fuel such kind of land finance nexus. Land and debt financing of infrastructure comes in diverse debt instruments with variable values, variable rates of return, variable maturity periods, and variable risk interest parameters. These are instruments of variegated timelines or temporalities, grouped and modeled into portfolios distinct from conventional financing of infrastructure and utilities under state natural monopolies. To avail of them, state agencies must come into versatile forms of special purpose partnerships with global financial institutions, syndicated banks, and consortia. This renders such partnerships and institutional arrangements ad hoc and temporary in nature, and the viability of each instrument subject to fluctuating market conditions. What does this imply for the nature of the state apparatus and the stability of the regime in Egypt? I don't know. The changes that I am trying to discuss seem to imply that the palpable collapse of the natural monopoly of the state stresses the importance of a regime that's main purpose is to de-risk the temporarily variegated debt instruments over other state structures and functions. This would render the state apparatus, at least in Egypt, increasingly reactive to debt markets, and could imply that the Egyptian infrastructure state itself is increasingly volatile. This is clear also with regards to state control and ownership of assets. Debt instruments may or may not be collateralized, and the projects financed by those instruments may or may not involve the transfer of asset ownership from public to private hands. Instead, the portfolios with intricate leveraging of instruments against each other and with complex risk interest distribution models, counter default measures, and recourse streams, while they are likely to generate instant liquidity in a country that is really thirsty for that, they at once render the capacity of the state to sustain timely revenue streams and counter defaults extremely precarious. So the precariousness is not just of citizens, but it's also of the state itself. This is particularly the case in Egypt, where lands and property registration are less than optimal and land markets opaque or dysfunctional, and tenancy is not clear. While this is business as usual to financiers, to me, these are inherent temporal risks that do not only affect the state structures and functions, but also make it difficult and very risky for the state to control its monetary and fiscal policies and the costs of living for ordinary citizens and businesses. There are few studies on the immediate correlation in the countries of Africa or the MENA region, including Egypt, yet as I am trying to discuss in the study I'm making, to tap into the temporarily variegated debt instruments, the ruling regime must assure investors of its commitment to realize future demand and returns on their investments. It does so by orienting its fiscal. Yep, I'm
so sorry to interrupt.
I'm almost done.
Yeah, okay, great. I was just gonna ask you to try and wrap it up within the next 3 or 4 minutes. And also the slide hasn't changed, so I'm not sure if that's intentional.
No, it's not. I just forgot. Thank you. So as I was saying, although there are few studies that tap into the temporarily variegated debt instruments, the ruling regime must assure investors of its commitment to realize future demand and returns on investment. It does so by orienting its fiscal and monetary policies towards de-risking the emerging asset class and re-engineering local financial systems to allow portfolio investors easy entry and exit from the new asset class. So we are witnessing the creation or already the workings and the operations of a new asset class. The successive devaluations of the Egyptian pound against the US dollar and other hard currencies since 2016 has had immediate negative impacts on the cost of living, the purchase power of households, on subsidies and social protection programs, and the viability of small, medium, or even large-scale local businesses. Counterintuitively, this temporal risk is also causing short-term fluctuations in the values and interest rates of the sovereign debt interest instruments themselves, such as treasury bills, adding more volatility to an otherwise safe state-owned instrument. The other risk, I mean, I have only 3 risks, 3 very complex risks. The second risk also resides within the investment portfolios. As I mentioned, these are intricately designed to synchronize variegated speculative valuations. whether we're talking about booking values, re-evaluations, depreciation, interest rates, maturity periods, amortization, default risks, volatile creditworthiness of institutions, countries, and even cities, but in Egypt it's only about countries. Portfolio management has direct implications on which, where, and when the projects are initiated, located, completed, or turned into ruins. While we could not access, while I'm doing this study with Temre Shayel, we could not access comparable information on specific projects, but we were able to get enough data on two major projects. However, judging by the recent hard currency situation in 2022, something like the speed with which the Cairo monorail is happening best testifies to these kinds of complex, variegated risk assessments and amortizations. However, there are certain things that remain. I clubbed them in 6 categories, and I call them getting the urban almost right. One of the things that really captures my attention is that the land infrastructure finance in Egypt often compels the state towards land dispossession with direct negative impacts on the poor, definitely. And I've discussed this extensively, the relationship between debt instruments and land-based financing and the program for demolitions of the so-called unplanned or haphazard neighborhoods. Nevertheless, the policies put into practice to meet financial and real estate speculative activities also affect the relatively well-off. They're not just the people who are poor or abject poverty or even in ashwaiyat, but also the well-off, and trigger a cascade of vulnerabilities of employment, healthcare, income, savings, and livelihoods across diverse income groups that begs examination. Unlike housing, statements about the mixed outcomes of mega infrastructure projects and real estate developments remain anecdotal and speculative. Serious studies of their impacts on demographic change, mass mobility, income disparities, land values, real estate values, and homelessness is needed. On a different note, the last one is desperate yet hopeful microecologies. I'm really interested in responses to this kind of vulnerabilities, whether it's for people, it's vulnerabilities of the state itself, vulnerabilities of the different debt instruments, and vulnerabilities of the projects. Voices opposing the privatization of public lands and the expropriation of private properties for infrastructure are heard, definitely. Yet, unlike opposition to privatization heard before 2011, when successive regimes were wary of large-scale dispossessions and of land resources, the current regime is completely different. It prides itself on doing what previous regimes dared not: bulldozing entire neighborhoods under the pretext of slum demolition, raising of self-built houses for road widening, periodic bans on private construction, military imposition of fines on building violations, speedy construction of private real estate developments on evicted plots, and recently the release of the state ownership policy document declaring the public assets on offer for speculative developments. When land becomes the primary vehicle for value generation and private finance, when land becomes the primary vehicle for value generation and private finance dictates its temporal and spatial logics, the threat of nationalization gets extremely diluted, but the power of eminent domain intensifies. The same regime that dared not scare away private finance would dispossess citizens for the sake of public benefit. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dalia. That was fascinating, and I have so many questions because over the past several decades, Cairo has seemed very much like a city that is perpetually under construction, and it's interesting to hear about how that never-ending development, as was displayed on your first slide, how that interrelates with global financial markets and the infrastructural scramble, as you mentioned. And I'll come back to that when we have the discussion portion, but thank you so much for your presentation. Before I move on to our next speaker, I want to remind the audience again to put any thoughts and questions either in the chat or to make note of it, and we'll come back later after the second presentation. And now I would like to take the opportunity to present our second speaker. Thomas Maloutas is Emeritus Professor at the Department of Geography, Harokopio University. His research and published work are focused on segregation and gentrification processes, the restructuring of housing systems and welfare regimes, and the changing social stratification in metropolitan areas in the era of capitalist globalization. Previously, Thomas has served as director of the Institute of Urban and Rural Sociology at the National Center for Social Research between 2001 and 2012, professor at the Department of Planning, University of Thessaly, and General Secretary for Research and Technology. Thomas has been invited to speak and teach internationally across several European, North American, East Asian, Middle Eastern, and Australian universities. Thomas, we welcome you to the panel and very excited to hear your presentation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for the invitation to this webinar. I'll try to be as much as concise as possible. Let me see if the sharing, is the sharing working?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay. My talk is focused on issues of housing and financialization and the way they are linked with short-term rentals in a city which is the north of the Mediterranean, a little bit between tradition and modernity, and at the border of East and West. The question I'll be raising is, as short-term rentals are very much in the public debate now, my question is, are short-term rentals the real culprit of what is happening in cities like Athens, in Mediterranean cities, and probably beyond? And are they the real main component of touristification, which is what is majorly a trend in cities like Athens, Naples, Lisbon, and several other cities of the region? Maybe now you see my screen in a better way, or has it changed at all?
Yes, we can see it very clearly.
Okay. It's good that Mona and Raquel have set the theoretical canvas for financialization and commodification, so that I can skip a few things. I will just stress the ones that I need to stress most. Let's say that short-term rentals began as another thing, as part of sharing economy. They quickly changed to a commodified process. And initially they were a response to the demands of expanding tourist waves that needed cheap accommodation and less ordinary traveling experiences. So it was a response also to demand, not only to the need of capital to make more profit. In terms of effects, short-term rentals had also some positive effects: renovation, increased work in the labor market in some parts, increased accommodation capacity for cities that wanted to develop tourism. And of course, they had the well-known negative effects of increased unaffordability, segregation and gentrification processes due to their spatially selective processes, plus the alienation of permanent residents from the way of their way of life, their communities, and I will try to skip this part. Just mention that all this happened in a world where inequalities increased, and inequalities not so much based on income, but based on wealth. And I will talk a little bit about financialization and commodification. But housing has been a commodity for not only for decades, but for centuries. When we say commodification of housing, what we mean is in comparison with what happened at the upper trend of the welfare state, and when housing was publicly provided to an important part of society, became a social right and a social good. So commodification is comparing the situation with that period, with that era. So in a way, financialization needed commodification to step on it. On the other hand, commodification does not necessarily lead to financialization, especially in areas of the planet like Southern Europe or the Arab world, which I know much less than Southern Europe, but where the commodity of housing was related to what Raquel said earlier. You bought a house for life. You bought a house for its use value. It was not its exchange value that was the primordial target of your accession to home ownership, let's say. So the financialization of the commodification process is a step where this changes and housing becomes not a use value for life, but an investment item that creates a much quicker and bigger housing mobility, transactions, and things like that. So in Southern Europe, short-term rentals that appeared in the previous decade were an enabler of financialization. They were at the same time a bonus for tourist industries, and they were an item that enabled also or triggered further segregation and gentrification in a region that was relatively having low segregation levels and a rather increased social mix. And all this created very important problems of housing affordability. Within now, within Southern Europe, which is the less regulated part of the European Union, which as a whole may be thought as the most regulated part of the planet. Within Southern Europe, Greece is an extreme case with, in terms of, let's say, unaffordability of housing, since, according to Eurostat data, you see that the overburdened percentage of households are very much higher in Greece than in the other three countries of Southern Europe, which are close to the EU median. And this happens not only for the very poor households, but even for the affluent ones. To sum up the way Greece and Athens compares to the rest of the region, here there is low production cost for housing, low prices for real estate investment, especially if you are coming from abroad, easy access for foreign investors, even for outside Europe through programs like Golden Visa. And all this has led to increased unaffordability of housing for local residents. And having set the main points of the, let's say, the housing market a little bit and short-term rentals in this city, I will try to depict two stories which are very different, but which both involve short-term rentals. The one is the waterfront, called the Athenian Riviera, and the other one is the densely built central neighborhoods of the city at the north of Omonia Square, for whoever of you have some knowledge of the geography of this city. The waterfront is a place which is not a stronghold of higher, upper ruling class, upper social strata. Upper social strata have always lived at the northern suburbs of the city, away from this coast. This coast was full of infrastructures: the old airport, a huge horse race track, other sport facilities, and other infrastructures. And only few parts of this coast were inhabited by upper middle classes. However, since the 90s, there is a demographic change, and especially the part of the Riviera that I will talk about, the community of Vari Vula Vuliarmeni, has been increasing in population very much, more than 70% in these 30 years, while the whole city has increased by 4%, and the center of the city has decreased by 23%. It has begun as a middle class leisure area weekend area. And during these years, it has been transformed to a principal main residence area of upper middle strata. It is in the vicinity of big projects that are really transforming the social profile of the whole city, but even more of its adjacent areas. The bigger one is the Hellinikon project in the territory of the old airport, where you have a 8 billion euro project with skyscrapers in a city that has no skyscrapers, with malls, with casinos, with luxury housing, and whatever you want. Not in the vicinity, but in the midst of this community that I'm talking about, you have a flagship investment, tourist investment of a 5-star resort hotel. You can see the pictures here, which has 1,200 employees. So it changes only with its specific weight, what happens in the city. Now there is a new big resort project that is agreed. The landowner is the Greek church. Previously, it worked as an orphanage, and now it will be a very luxurious resort. All this has created a huge demand for real estate in the area. And this huge demand and the services that you can have now is very expensive beaches. If you want to have a day bed in the beach you see with the many parasols, you have almost to pay the equal amount of the minimum wage in the local labor market. Dining is also very, very expensive, and accommodation in this Four Seasons hotel, I checked it today, it is the minimum price, where you don't see the sea, but you see the trees, is 1,700 euros per night. And if you want a small suite overlooking the sea, it's 6,500 per night, which is absolutely not inadequate, nothing to do with the local labor market. I cannot change the slide. Can
What's
you?
happening when you're trying to change the slide? Is it
Yes, I'm trying to change the slide, but I see the same slide.
Okay, let me try and share from my side, if you'd like.
Yeah. Let me. Okay. Now it changed.
It changed on your side?
It's yeah. I used another thing and it changed.
All right, then I'll stop sharing from my side then.
Yeah. Within this providing very high-priced services, you have also adjacent services that are addressed to a much broader audience. So there is a wave of visitors, not only in the weekends, but every day in this place. So you can make money through investments in this place in many different ways. It's not one way, luxury accommodation and restaurants. Plus, you have, of course, numerous short-term rentals, which cannot accommodate not even a part of the need for accommodation in the area, plus leisure activities, sport activities, whatever you want. All this has changed rapidly in the last 5 years. The face, the facade of the community, which was a little bit like this, with relatively ugly but ordinary, let's say, buildings, apartment buildings, and which are replaced all the time with small gated communities with swimming pools on each balcony. Very, very expensive, out of the reach of local demand. So all these changes that are happening in the area have really been changing the social profile of residents, have changed the social profile and the performance of local schools, have also changed who buys real estate in the area.
Thomas, if I could apologetically interrupt, if it's possible to wrap it up in the next 3 to 4 minutes, that would be great.
Yes. So this is one story. The other story is a completely different story, and it goes a little bit together with what Raquel said about the financialization of precarity, of informality. Here it's not informality, but it's precarity. So in the very densely populated and very densely built areas of the city, you have a part of the apartment blocks that have been, for 30 years, have been inhabited by low-income people, mainly migrants and refugees who could not find any other place to live in the city. They lived in small apartments at the lower floors of these apartment buildings in the city center. And there is literature about this vertical segregation that you can find in these buildings, as well as in terms of social profile, as well as in terms of ethnic profile. There is, since the crisis and the aftermath of the crisis and the rise of tourist demand, there is an entry, a rapid entry in the housing market of foreign investors. And this foreign investment has been driven by tourist demand and by short-term rentals, which are a way of making money through having exploiting, let's say, the increasing tourist numbers. The financialization of housing in this case means that the small disadvantaged apartments that were in nobody's interest, no gentrifier would like to buy a thing like that, have become in the touristification period an investment item, since they can be transformed to a tourist accommodation. Because if you are the occasional gentrifier that will stay for a week or 10 days in the city and would like to be near the Acropolis or the other tourist of tourist interest places, then you can. And if you are in Montreal or New York and you choose the place, you will not even notice that it is in a basement or a ground floor, and it's not very important. So, so all this stock, which was serving low-income households for 30 and more years, now is in danger of being financialized through short-term rentals and this kind of financialization. And now there is even a literature in lifestyle magazines where you can have discourses about how beautiful are these semi-basement apartments, and how interesting it is to invest in these. So this is also an area which is changing, a different social profile progressively, a different profile of who goes to school in the area, who buys what, and the two stories are in the same city. Financialization story is in the same city, but with different actors, with different processes, with different outcomes. And what I will just keep as an item in the end is that all this process has brought housing in different ways in the political agenda. In a country where housing was never on the political agenda in the 4, 5, 6 decades before that. It was a family issue that you had to solve on your own. Now it has become so unaffordable that housing has become an item in the political debate. This does not mean that it will be solved in the right way, but at least it is discussed. Thank you, and sorry for the delay if I was delayed.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Very, very interesting presentation, and the weaving of the global financialization of the housing sector that was discussed early on in the session, and weaving that together with how it specifically manifests in the Greek context. I found that incredibly fascinating. I do have some questions myself, but I would like to open the floor to the audience to ask any questions that they have. So please raise your hand if you have questions. So we have a question from Melanie Silver. Please go ahead.
Great. I hope you can hear me. I love the,
yes.
Thank you first for all the presentations. From what I could see, a lot of it was looking at obviously in the past, particularly about 50 years or so, where the financialization of housing has really boomed. What are the forecasts into the future? If there's any literature or knowledge of where, is this going to be a continuation, or there's a, I guess, a discussion, maybe there'll be a boomerang effect at some point, or something else to that effect?
Thomas or Dalia, would anyone like to comment on that?
Yeah, I didn't expect that it was first for me. Look, there is a pessimist prognosis that I could make, that things will go deeper, and financialization will become harsher in terms of impact. And this is mainly due to the political scenery that I see not only in Greece, in most of European countries, and beyond. Now that the financialization issue is discussed here, it is discussed in a fragmented way, and as if we regulate short-term rentals, we can regulate the problem, which is not the case, because short-term rentals are just a small part of the whole process. You have to make a broader regulation in order to be able to have some impact. In Athens, you have almost no regulation at all, but in other cities like Barcelona, like Lisbon, or like Berlin, you have initiatives and policies that reduce the amount of time that you can rent your flat for short term, or you can reduce the number of listings in an area. But this does not provide a solution by itself. So,
yes, because just let me jump on the discussion, because when we talk about financialization, we are not talking about one aspect. It has different faces, it has different forms. So the idea is, if we want to stop financialization and to cut this empire, which we don't have a very good prognosis on that, we should cut the link between finance and build space. We should reform the instruments like real estate investment trust, like real estate funds, like many other, like Airbnb, and many other instruments that would induce the facility of the attraction of finance to go in and go out very quickly. So a very deep reform on these instruments, and those instruments are economic and financial instruments. So it's a discussion with the Ministry of Finance, but it is also a discussion with planning and local
Yes.
authorities at the same time, because we are talking about instruments, planning instruments, we are talking about housing policy instruments, infrastructure instruments, as Dalia was showing us, but at the same time, we were talking about financial instruments. So in order to disentangle that, we should, and I'm sorry that I jumped in the middle, but I have to go, and I wanted just to say goodbye and thanks for this opportunity, and also make a little intervention on that before leaving. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it was positive, and I would add to what you say that it's not all pessimistic. In the European Union now, there is a project which relates housing with climate transition, and it's called the New European Bauhaus project, and it tries to link sustainability, aesthetics, and inclusiveness. So there is a kind of growing culture, even at the level of the European Union, which leaves some espoir, some hope for a better course in the future. But I don't think it's for tomorrow. It's for a little bit after tomorrow, and it depends on the broader political scene and how it will evolve. And the way the broader political scene evolves throughout the world is not the best way.
Can I jump in here?
Yes, please.
Although I'm not sure that Melanie was interested in the Cairo, maybe she was interested more in the European context. But when it comes to Egypt, the prognosis is both positive and negative. And in order for us to find a way, because that's the question that keeps us busy, how is it going to unfold? We are seeing many big projects, including housing projects, that are almost in ruins, as in they are the ruins of the future. Nobody is actually occupying. And this has to do with so many factors. One, to start with, as I mentioned, the planning instruments are almost non-existent. The banking sector that allows for mortgage and other instruments for a long while has been very regressive. And in a sense, sometimes some scholars feel comfortable that Egyptian banks were not they are risk averse. In most of their investments, they are risk averse. They don't go for risk. They don't offer instruments that can actually risk the savings, which are already around maximum of 20% of the households and individuals have bank accounts in Egypt. The majority of the population are not also investors, as in risk takers. We have seen lately, for instance, that those who can afford to save their Egyptian pounds put it in gold, and many others, they are not even a large part, they are taking to real estate. Not to mention that the real estate as an investment is not entirely formalized. There are lots of informal housing that is also seen by the low-income brackets as an investment, as a safe haven. So in order for us to find a way or to draw any kind of an imagined scenario, there's a lot that is more local. And also one aspect that I wanted to speak about is the emergence of the non-banking financial institutions. And these can range for small-scale non-banking who are ready, like for instance, lately last week, I think, or 2 weeks ago, there was the first non-banking financial investments in gold bullions. So in a sense, there are lots of stuff that has to be considered if we are to find an answer to Melanie's question. And it purely has to do with the capacity of the economy and the structures of the institutions in a place like Egypt that were mostly regressive, risk averse. So it might mean good for Egypt, but at the same time, it's too early to tell.
Are there any other questions? I invite anyone with questions to raise their hand. All right, well, if nobody has questions, I actually have a question for Dalia, and it goes back to your explanation of the convergence between multilateral development architecture and private financial markets, especially when we think about this, not only in the context of infrastructure, but in the context of housing. It really underscores this increasing distance between who owns the housing unit or project, how they perceive this unit or project as a financial asset, and who's inhabiting these housing projects on the ground. And it reminds me of something that sociologist Saskia Sassen mentioned in 2019, that the value of investment housing globally, which is real estate that functions as a financial asset, is more than twice global GDP. And my question to you is, what hope do we have to unpack this as housing practitioners when so much of the financial sector seems to operate in almost a different language? And we as, whether it's sociologists or anthropologists or urban planners, we don't have that language. We don't understand it. We need to basically go back and do our homework all over again. And, I'm interested to hear about your journey as an anthropologist by training and teaching in the public policy departments. What was that journey like to try and unpack this complex world?
Well, it's like an off-the-cuff answer, and I can say that when it comes to trying to understand the situation, I always compare the two places that I think I understand the most, which is India and Egypt. And in the case of Egypt, we really do not have what it takes to make any sound assessment of how things are or will go. Because, for instance, the type of data that we have is completely analog. For instance, I'll give you a very simple example. The government has introduced multiple land value capture instruments that have changed the real estate values on the ground. And this, we have no idea about how the actual change is. Not to mention that we don't even attempt to make an association between the changing real estate values on the ground and the people's behaviors in terms of whether they stay in their properties or they move or they invest or they rent. So this is one thing that's completely missing, an association, a dynamic association between what the finance does to the real estate value, including housing and commercial units and property, and the actual behavior. And I think this was very clear. It was highlighted in the rush to buy gold compared to an almost stagnant secondary market in housing, not to mention the primary market, which we have maybe Yahya Shaukat later on will speak about that. But in a sense, we do not have a dynamic monitoring of something like the behavior of households and individuals across the income spectrum. Where do they put their money? What happens to the value of their properties? Whether they shift in use of this property or use it as a collateral or as an investment. So this is one aspect, lack of any dynamic data that can lead us to answer this question. The second is the fact that we do not have access to the structural changes that are taking place. So for instance, what does the banks offer? What are different banks offering? As I mentioned earlier, mostly banks in Egypt are risk averse. So for instance, the introduction of the derivative markets, Egypt is very reluctant. And the derivative market can actually really speed up a serious crisis. But one can only say, thanks to being regressive and risk averse, that we have not threaded into the derivative market so fast or so extensive that we can risk the entire situation. The third is the fact that we do not have registry as well. So we don't know if one property, what is the value of this property. The valuation systems and dynamics in Egypt also is very opaque. So to answer your question, Deena, we have to resolve at least the dynamic data that is not available. And not to mention, the fourth thing, as I mentioned, is that most of what takes place as financialization of housing is actually a minuscule in terms of the actual ownership or rentals of the housing stock, especially that a large part, almost 60 plus or 70, is actually in the informal sector.
Thank you so much, Dalia, for your response. I think we have time maybe for one more question. Soha, go ahead, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Deena. I actually wanted to follow up on including everything related to the digital and linking it to financialization and land and housing. I wish Raquel was with us, but Thomas, since you referenced a paper on Airbnb in your presentation, I think you might be able to answer me. I am a bit hesitant about all the time demonizing everything related to the digital when we're talking about land and housing and anything actually in the world. And I know a lot of people are a bit afraid of AI and ChatGPT and things like that. But speaking of Airbnb, I actually find it a tool where people can hijack the system sometimes. Because me as a user of Airbnb, sometimes I know that I use it to go to certain places instead of going to a hotel, a very luxurious high-end hotel. I know that if I want to use Airbnb, I can find an apartment for $20 versus an apartment for $100 per night, for example. I know also that I can meet new people. I know a lot of people use it to have some income, sometimes people who come maybe from lower classes. So I wanted to know if this experience is similar in other contexts, because I'm thinking of the Lebanese local context, although I've also tried it in New York, and I know that I could like stay for a while in New York because of Airbnb actually. So I'm thinking of these digital tools as ways to help us hijack the system, as I said, and because they're much more, it makes actually land more accessible to a wide range of people from different social backgrounds and different income groups. So yes, I just want to hear from you.
I absolutely agree, and this was a little bit the purpose of my talk. Probably I haven't made it clear that it's we should not demonize the weapon. It's the process and those who manipulate it that make it a different thing. I also use very much Airbnb, and a few years ago, I was able through that process to go to Latin America for 45 days and on a very low budget. If I had to go the regular way, it would be completely different, and I could stay 10 days. the thing is that Airbnb, the problem is not its digital substance or the process is it's being practiced. It's who is involved in that. In the beginning, it was mainly small landowners who shared their own apartment and rented a room. So it's kind of sharing economy. But then in most countries, now you have 85% or 90% of the listings that are homes, whole apartments or whole homes. So it's a commodity. It's not part of your life. The room that your child has grown up and left, and you have a spare room and you can rent it for 2 months to some traveler. So it's a marginal part of the Airbnb business now, this sharing economy. So it's an investment, and it's an investment in another way that can enlarge the product of the tourist business, because not many people can afford the ordinary hotel services. But it's not, the providers are people who have at least 1 or 2 housing units beyond the one they live in. So it's a commodification and further financialization if you go deeper into the process. It's not the tool, it's the way it is used. And the way it is used can be regulated. Who regulates? Political power. But political power, let's say in Greece, is not very interested in regulating this process in a way that we understand. It's mainly an item in their heads that can increase the development numbers. So since they are in a liberal economic trajectory, what they see is leave the investors free to do what they want. And if you do that, it's the best outcome. Now they see that there are questions of housing unaffordability. And now there is a red light for them. There is a kind of, but what they propose to regulate these problems are really ineffective.
Thank you so much to Thomas and Dalia and Mona and Raquel for such a stimulating discussion. I wish we had more time to discuss further. Unfortunately, we've already kept you all over time. And I just want to remind everybody, we have another event next Tuesday, and I hope to see you all there. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of the day or evening.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That white area?